All right, thank you, Megan, and thanks everyone for joining me this afternoon. As Megan said, my name is Tala Cox. I am a LIMS informatics consultant with CSOLs, and I specialize in biobanking largely for the R&D space and mostly with LabVantage. I've spent about 6 years, honestly coming up on 7 in LIMS, doing configuration and customization and support mostly at a large academic research center, and then more recently with CSOLs. Before that, I was a lab tech. My undergraduate degrees were actually biology and microbiology. And then I was an undergraduate researcher working on Francisella tularensis. And then later on, after I graduated, I did 6 years doing infectious disease screening and HLA typing on organ donors. So I'd like to think that this kind of split background gives me a useful perspective within the LIMS space as a bridge between the lab and IT. So what are we going to be talking about today? I want to quickly touch on what biobanking is, just make sure we're all on the same page, and then dive into 2 possible approaches for tracking your biobank's associated data, spreadsheet and LIMS. I'm going to go through pros and cons of both approaches. Spoiler alert, I'm going to come down pretty heavily on the side of LIMS. And then at the end, as Megan said, we'll have some time for questions. I anticipate talking for about 30 minutes, and that should leave about 30 minutes for the questions. So let's dive right in. So what is biobanking? Biobanking is the storage or banking of biological samples. Sounds pretty simple up front, but maybe when you start with like 1 box in a freezer, that seems easy, but then you amplify that to a whole freezer full or an entire freezer farm full of boxes, full of freezers, just full of samples everywhere, and it gets complicated fast. I often like to compare biobanking to library science. Library science is this field, you're like, well, you have a book on the shelf in the library, how hard can it get? But people get entire PhDs and have entire careers in the best practices for managing collections and for managing all that associated information and data. So while it kind of seems simple to start, samples in a freezer is a biobank, it gets a lot of hidden complications and concerns. So I wanted to throw in some examples of biobanks, some of which I've worked with and some of which I only dream of working with. In the academic research space, there are things like the general research biobanks, where a large institution may have a non-specific consent for participants to donate samples to research across the whole institution. You also may see more specific research biobanks, some for individual large-scale longitudinal studies where they're collecting enough samples to really start considering their repository a biobank. Others for things like rare diseases. It's very common for rare diseases because if a researcher wants to work on a rare disease, it can be really, really hard to find participants that have the disease. That's why they call it rare. So you'll have a whole bunch of researchers and doctors in the realm of that particular disease. My example is the Castleman Disease Collaborative Network Biobank, that get together and form a biobank so that when a researcher wants to work on the disease, they just go to the biobank and say, hey, I need this many samples, and off they go. Commercial biobanks operate in a similar way where a researcher or a company or someone who has some need for these samples can go to the commercial biobank and say, hey, I need these samples for this research, here's my money, and they get samples. One example of this would be the Plasma Services Group. If you have ever donated plasma, some of your donation may have gone here. There are government biobanks. So CHTN is a cancer-focused biobank in the US that is run by the US government. It was founded in 1987, and I would love to know what they were using to track their data in 1987. Biobank Sweden is all of the Swedish healthcare system, major hospitals linked together for the terms of research through their Health and Social Care Inspectorate. There are also non-human biobanks. So a fun one is the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, which you may have seen in a James Bond movie. And then my personal nerdy favorite is the San Diego Zoo's Wildlife Alliance Frozen Zoo. The Frozen Zoo freezes genetic material from every animal they can get their hands on. And the ultimate goal of that is genetic rescue for endangered and even extinct species via cloning. So they actually just successfully birthed their second Przewalski's wild horse clone in April, which I think is pretty cool. All these examples, all of them have various data tracking needs. Without good data backing up your biobank, you've just got a whole bunch of tubes in a freezer taking up space. So what